Okay. Welcome to the third module, which is the Watershed Approach. The Watershed Approach is the philosophy that underlies all of our training at G3, and it's based on the understanding of how a natural watershed works, or a natural water cycling system works. And essentially, this system is all about water coming from the sky. It gets intercepted by plants. Those plants take the water, gently direct it down toward the ground. It gets slowed down, it gets spread out, it's put onto the soil. Gravity is working on it, it's pulling that water down through the profile of the soil. It infiltrates and fills the root zone of the plants. And this is really important because a lot of stuff is happening here. We have infiltration pulling down, we've got capillary action that's working on the water, pulling it kind of sideways and even up toward the surface. And all of those pore spaces in the soil are filled, in the root zone, are filled with water. And gravity continues to work on it, pulling that water down, allowing it to percolate down into a water table if it's available. Capillary action keeps moving on it so that the water will actually begin to move toward the local waterway, which, whatever that is, it might be just the water table, or it might actually be a creek or a river or lake or even the ocean. And so water's in constant motion. And the key here is that the water from the sky is passing through a beautiful system of plants and soil, and it's moving through that system slowly. And really the critical thing is that the water is held in the soil. That is because it's been slowed down, it's allowed to be held in the soil, and it's being cleaned by the plants and the soil before that water makes its way back into a water body. And that's really important because terrestrial systems have evolved in order to clean the terrestrial pollutants. Water systems can't clean terrestrial pollutants. And that's important for us to remember, because when we have water that is coming from land areas and it's polluted and it's running toward and it's gathering in our waterways, those water systems don't have any way of eradicating that pollution. Where if it had just passed through plants and soil, it would have been negated. So this is a really important function, in addition to the function of the water just being held there. And so then when the sun comes out, through a process called evapotranspiration, that water is transferred back up into the atmosphere, and it's managed by plants to go back into the atmosphere. Plants actually will take the water out of the soil, convert it into vapor, and put it up into the atmosphere. Eventually, there's enough water vapor in the atmosphere that it can condense, and it comes back down as precipitation. And so there are a bunch of things happening here. And yes, it's probably, that as like the water cycle, but it's a very particular water cycle. And we're going to talk a lot about it in Module 10. It's called the small water cycle. And it is essentially the way that we create gentle, regular precipitation over terrestrial areas, is by having this system of plants and healthy living soil. So that is the sustainable system that a natural watershed is. And a natural watershed actually helps connect people with their biophilia. And this is an important thing for us to remember when we're spreading the message of the importance of landscaping, and we're talking about, why landscapes are part of the environmental solution. It's important for us to remember that humans are part of the natural environment, and we are innately connected to that natural environment. And it's really only through shaping, we're taught to not be connected to it. So we want to go back. We want to help people come back to this natural feeling of biophilia, this this connection to the earth. And a lot of the things that we are going to be talking about today are going, not just today, actually through the whole course, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about help us connect. And especially when we talk about soil and we talk about how plants are managing the environment, so biophilia is something that allows us to have this deep connection to nature, and it's nurturing and it's calming, and that's something that's really important for us, I think, in these times. So when we talk about the watershed approach, there's a lot. We often get pushback from people saying, "Oh, well, it's more expensive to do," or this sustainable thing, it's just a label, that kind of thing. And so we have looked for studies that have actually compared conventional landscapes with sustainable or watershed approach landscapes. And there's an excellent one in California that was done. It's a side-by-side comparison of two 1,500 square foot lots, residential lots. The first one was developed in what's going to be called a conventional landscape. It has turf grass, it has high water use plants. The irrigation system's a spray system. There's no weather-based irrigation control, and it doesn't harvest any rainwater in the soil. And it's fertilized and just managed in a conventional manner. On the other hand, right next door was a sustainable or watershed-wise landscape constructed. That one utilized climate appropriate, but predominantly local California native plants. It captured rainwater on site into the soil. It had healthy living soil, no fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides applied. It had an drip irrigation system, and it had a weather-based irrigation controller. And so these two gardens were put side by side. The same team managed those two gardens. And over the course, they took the study over 15 years. Over the course of that time, they came up with an average of 3 major metrics, although they looked at a lot of benefits and things in these gardens, but 3 key metrics: water use, yard waste generated, and hours required to maintain. And what you can see is that the sustainable landscape, or what they call the sustainable landscape, required 10% of the water that the conventional landscape did. That's not a surprise, because that comes down to irrigation system and plant material, as we're going to learn going forward. But still, 90% water savings on average annually. So that's huge right there. And then the other metric that is big is this yard waste thing, because conventional landscapes are often viewed as being easy to manage, low maintenance landscapes, a lawn landscape, low maintenance. Well, it turns out that those systems are, since they're managed all the time, they're generating a huge amount of yard waste, and that yard waste, that organic matter, has to be processed somewhere. So it's so much that it's difficult to process it on a small site like 1,500 square feet. So it needs to be taken off site. It needs to be turned into compost and then brought back. It's, and that process is fossil fuel based. It's got a lot of energy. It's got, labor and expense for the community to manage an individual's organic matter. On the other hand, the sustainable landscape was only generating 250 pounds of yard waste a year. And that could be processed through a compost pile in the landscape, or as chop and drop, where the plants were pruned and then the organic matter was left in the landscape. So that's a big difference from a community perspective, because those are kind of hidden costs to property owners when they are generating something that the community is actually paying for, and it's not a benefit. And then finally, the third metric was maintenance hours. And again, those conventional landscapes are considered low maintenance, but someone comes every week and they mow the lawn and they, cut the plants and they do all this stuff. And on the sustainable landscape, it wasn't like that because the plants actually were planted the proper distance. They were acclimatized, they were acclimated to that particular environment. And they only needed to be managed, a few times a year instead of every single week. And so even if these were being maintained by the property owners, that's still a huge amount of time that just was not being put into the landscape, of the sustainable landscape. And then there are all these other multiple benefits that they really weren't measuring the metrics of, but were keeping track of, like the visits from birds and the visits from insects, and especially the charismatic insects like bees and butterflies and all that stuff. The smell of the garden, of the sustainable garden, the fact that there were no fertilizers or pesticides or whatever put down. And actually, anecdotally, I will tell you that it was also observed that when children were let into these gardens, they gravitated toward the sustainable garden because it had all these like fun things to do. It was like creek beds and things to play in. So it was a totally different play environment as well. Anyway, the point is that the sustainable landscape ended up costing a little bit more in the beginning when it was constructed, and in large part because it was done so long ago that many of those materials were not, they were new. And so getting them and having professionals who knew how to install them was a little bit of a challenge. But nonetheless, a little bit more expensive, 10% to do the sustainable landscape. But within that first year, the catch up that was beginning to happen, and so there is a payback discussion about this, but really it paid back very, very quickly, that little extra amount. And then, as I said, because it had all these multiple benefits, that was payback of a different kind. So that is in your packet. You will find slides that have more information on them than what you're seeing right here in the lecture. So I want to encourage you to download the slide pack and work through it, because it's set up almost like a workbook and has a lot more background and information if you want to learn more about these two gardens. And here you can see what they look like next to each other. They're completely different looking. So yeah. Now, so we really, after many years of experience with these different kinds of landscapes, we developed this idea of the watershed approach to landscaping applied to every single property. So we want to start treating every property as though it's a mini watershed. And what that means is we're evaluating where the water falls on the top of the property and where it runs off the property, and everything in between we control. We have a way of measuring it, and we have a way of having influence on that. And in order to evaluate the landscape, and also then to come up with strategies for reducing water use and other inputs and managing it more efficiently, we have created these 4 principles. So we're going to use this watershed idea as like the big picture, and then we are we're bringing it down to our smaller landscapes. And there are 4 principles of the watershed approach. The first one is that we grow healthy living soil that acts like a sponge. So if you think about a sponge, when it is wet and you wring it out, is it bone dry? No. It has a little bit of moisture in it. And that's what we want to be happening with our soils. We want our soils to be holding on to a little bit of moisture, even in dry times. Also, we want them to behave like a sponge in wet times, because think about the sponge when you're pouring water into it. Is the water coming out the other side at the same rate as it's going in? No, the sponge actually manages the timing of the water. So the water is dripping out the other side. And that's what we want to have happen in wet times, because that's how we slow down things like soil movements. landslides and erosion. We want that sponge to be managing the amount of water that is in the environment. The second thing is we passively capture rainwater as a resource, which means that we are holding rainwater in the soil. So passive capture is different from active capture. Active capture involves a device, and essentially it says we're going to use a device to hold on to water, and then we are going to pump that water out and utilize it beneficially in the landscape in some way. This is passive capture, which simply means that we direct water into our landscapes for the benefit of the landscape. And we allow the plants and soil to hold on to the water that it wants and get rid of the water that it doesn't want. The third thing is we're going to select climate appropriate plants. So we're going to be able to really hone in on plants that are adapted to our particular climate. Those are essentially local native plants. This is not a workshop on local natives nationwide, right? This is a workshop on identifying plants that are adapted to our particular climate, and then using them in our landscapes in order to reduce the resources that have to be input into the landscape. And then the fourth thing is we use highly efficient supplemental irrigation only when necessary. Now that has to be broken down because it's a really packed sentence. Highly efficient irrigation, first of all. That means that the equipment was manufactured properly, the system was designed, installed, and managed properly. Supplemental irrigation means that we are using irrigation after we have either held on to rainwater or done other techniques to minimize the amount of water that's required by the landscape. And then only when necessary means that we are applying the water to the landscape only when the plants actually need it. So this is the essence of highly efficient irrigation. It's designed properly and installed properly, it's managed properly, the system itself is managed and maintained properly, and we are managing the application of water so that it is only beneficial to the landscape. And most of this workshop is about that. Okay, so our watershed-wise landscapes are really designed to help us to live on local resources, and that is changing across the US. What our expectation of local resources is, but especially local water resources. So, in the arid West, we are confronting this. We have been confronting it for years, and it continues to be exacerbated by, really epic droughts. But the same thing is happening across the country, in the eastern seaboard, in Florida and the South, through Texas, the plains, the Great Plains. They're all facing times of drought and then deluge. And so we want to figure out how can we manage land so that we are either eliminating or reducing these effects of weather, but we are also able to have a resilient landscape while these changes are occurring. And our definition of efficiency for outdoor water use, and that's really, what like WaterSense is all about. Outdoor water use efficiency for us. What does it mean? For decades, it has meant irrigation efficiency. Well, what if really we want to reduce the use of irrigation? So our definition of outdoor water use efficiency is, yes, irrigation efficiency plus rainwater use efficiency. And we want to put these two things together to have a efficient watershed-wise landscape.